In this video, we are going to look at some other operations that you can perform with data that is in the input buffer. In previous videos, we've looked at getline and we've looked at get. I want to show you three other things you can do with data that's in the input buffer. And we're going to introduce three new functions: the ignore function, peek, and put back. This is going to be also a study of how data is handled from the input buffer by your program. Look at the variables. I've got a couple of string variables declared, and I have several character variables declared, and they're all initialized to just a single blank, as I've done before. This time there's a ch5. And then I've got some other stuff declared here, and you'll see that in use as we proceed. Again, I've got a program that's partially complete. There are a lot of cout statements, and I will go over several cases here that we will look at in order to process some data in the input buffer. So in each case, I have a cout statement which just writes to the screen what we're trying to do, and in the first case we want to use get. And then there's an instruction to enter the data exactly as shown. If we are working with data in the input buffer, we do have to type it in each time. Once it's in your program, you can't really put it back in the input buffer easily. So for each of these cases, we will be entering this string of information here. So you can see it's just a mixture of some characters, some letters, and some numbers, but embedded in this, there's something that kind of looks like a time. So we will consider this to be a time in the upcoming examples. To begin with, let's just look at cin.get again, and let's read some information that we type in. Let's read, we will type that into the input buffer, and then we will add some code here to read it in. So this will be pretty simple. I'm just going to read in with cin.get several characters. Okay, ch1, and I'll close that with a parentheses. And this is the end of a C++ statement with the semicolon. And since this is a very short statement, I can put several on the same line. So I'm going to do that. So here's another statement, but it's on the same line. cin.get, and I'll read in ch2. And I'll put a semicolon there. And cin.get ch3. And then we'll do one more. We'll do ch4. Okay, now I want to do a cout statement where we will write that information back out to the screen. So it's just cout, and I'll just write out each one of these characters: ch1, ch2, ch3, and ch4, and then we'll do an end line, and better put a semicolon after that. Okay, a semicolon. And then I'm just going to do a system pause so that we can stop the program at this point and examine it. There's a semicolon. Now, let's go ahead and compile the program and run it, and then I'll explain what's going on. The program's running, so let's look at the output. And here you see the output. So we have our banner processing data from the input buffer. Case number 1, read all the data one character at a time with cin.get. And then we want to enter this data exactly as shown. Now notice that the cursor is blinking over there, so our program is waiting for us to type in some data. And I'm just going to go ahead and type it all in, and I'll pause the program while I'm doing that. So now I've typed in the data exactly as shown up here. So that is telling us how to type it in, and that comes from this line. So I'm going to follow my instructions, and I'll type it in exactly the same way. So I'll hit enter, and you'll see that our output is QXR0. And that is because we had our cin statements, cin.get statements, to read in 4 characters: ch1, ch2, ch3, ch4. So we didn't read in everything. We just read in 4 characters. So the input that we've typed is this entire string of information, but my program is only reading in 4 characters and then printing them back out. Each time we do a get, then it pulls off one of the characters from the input buffer. So all of this information is in the input buffer to begin with, and the first get ch1, is going to read the q. Then the next get, for get ch2, reads the x. Then I do a get ch3 to read r. I get ch4, and it reads the 0. Then I just print those 4 characters back to the screen, and that's what you see here. Now, the point here is that there's still a lot of information in the input buffer. Everything here is still waiting to be read in. So my program has to be able to do something with that data that's still there in the input buffer. How do we deal with that? Well, in this instance, all I'm going to do is to just do a get line to read everything else, and I'll print that out. But what I want to show you, and the point of this program, is each time your program does an input operation, it picks up some information from the input buffer, and it may not get everything. All right, so let's go modify the program to read everything else. Alrighty, I'm going to take out this blank line here, and I'll insert another line here that will read in the remainder of the input buffer, and that'll be getline. Getline, cin, comma, and I have a variable which I'm going to call that remainder up here. I'll use the remainder variable to collect all the remaining information that's in the input buffer. So that reads everything. So remember, getline is going to read everything that you type in until it encounters the end of line character, which you insert by hitting the return key. Now let's print that out. Okay, cout, okay, double quote, remainder of input buffer is equal to, and then we'll print out remainder, then an end line. Now, this will read everything in the input buffer. So let's compile and run the program again. So the program's running. Here's the output window. And I have again typed in the data exactly as I'm instructed. So this time the the get statements, they will get the first 4 characters, and then those will be printed. And we will use the get line to get everything else in the input buffer all the way up until we hit the enter key. So now let's hit the enter key and make the program run. And here you see the output. All right, so the Q, X, R, and 0, those still were input by the cin.get. Then we had the get line to read in everything else, and that is what you see here. Okay, we have the 3, 30, 15, all the way over to .33. So the cin.get statements, they read the first 4 characters, which left us with this in the input buffer. Then I used getline to read the remainder, and so you can see here's the remainder that's in the input buffer. All right, so let's stop and analyze this just a little bit further. In order to explain this better, I am going to go back up here and modify this a little bit because I want to add some comments. So even though I could have all those on the same line, I want to make some room for comments, because I want to put a comment here that indicates what's left in the input buffer each time I execute one of these cin.get statements. So here's the comment, and it'll be input buffer contains, and let's say now contains, since we have read 1 character. Okay, so input buffer now contains this information here. We've read the Q, but the input buffer still has that. So I'll copy that and paste it over here. So you need to be able to follow this. Each time you do an input operation, you need to be able to understand what's left in the input buffer that still needs to be read. Okay, so I'm just going to copy and paste that comment and modify it as we go down. So here we do the cin.get, we get ch2. So in that case, the letter X is input and saved in ch2, so it no longer exists in the input buffer. Then we read ch3, so that's going to read the R, so that'll be gone, and the input buffer will have 03 colon 30 and so on. And then when we read in ch4, then we have read in this 0. So now it is taken from the input buffer, and here's the information that remains. So each time we read in something, then there's kind of like an internal pointer that moves us to the next thing to input. And depending upon what we're reading, depending on the type of the variable, whether it's a string, an integer, a float, or so on, then it can read in different amounts of information. So we'll see that. But since we have a character type, then it can only read one character at a time, so that's all we get. Then finally, we do our cin, getline cin remainder, and we read in everything else here. So let me copy this and paste it. And the input buffer at this point is now empty. So then we read everything that's left, and there's nothing left in the input buffer for us to read. So that's what's going on with this program. Now let's modify the program, and let's use get to read in all the other information instead of using getline. So let's take this out. We'll take out the getline, we'll take out the cout. And now I want to add some code so that I can read in everything from the input buffer using cin.get. I'm just going to reuse one variable that I've declared up here, ch5, and I'm not going to save the data. I'm just going to read it in and print it back to the screen. But this will illustrate how you can use get inside a loop to read in data from the input buffer. So I have a while loop. So while the ch5 is not equal to a single quote and a backslash and an n. So that is saying the backslash n character, that goes into the input buffer when you hit the enter key or the return key, depending upon your keyboard. So when you type in all of this information, then you hit enter, and it isn't, it's not something that'll show up on the screen, but at the very end, you'll see this backslash n character, or it's in there, it's in the input buffer. So get can read one character at a time. So when I read that end of line character, that tells me I'm done with the input and I can exit the loop. And ch5 starts out with a blank, so I've initialized it to a blank, and that's not equal to the end of the line, so I know that this is going to work okay the first time. So let's put the curly braces in here for the while loop. Then we need to just read and print out the characters with cin.get, cin.get ch5, semicolon, and then we'll write that out to the screen, cout ch5, and I'll just use a semicolon here because I don't want to print them one per line. So this will print them out together left to right with no spaces. But then after the loop, I'll do the cout with the end line here. Now, that will be a different way to complete case number 1. Then the system pause kicks in and we stop the program there. Now, let's compile the program and run it. So the program is running, and here are the instructions on the screen. So we are supposed to type in this information, and instead of typing it in, I'm just going to copy it and paste it. So I'll copy it, and then I'll paste it here. Then it's ready to go into the input buffer. When I hit the enter key, it goes into the input buffer, and then the program can process it. So I'll hit the enter key, and here we get the output. So the QXR0 comes from the cout statement from up there that we already had. Then the rest of the data is entered one character at a time and then output one character at a time until we get to the end of the line. So that's the output that we see here. So the rest of the data now is printed to the screen with the using the get statement to read in one character at a time, and then the cout to print one character at a time. So here's one example of how you can manipulate data and read data in from the input buffer using a character type and reading it one character at a time. The next example I want to show you in this program, it's really a trivial example. So case number 2, we want to read all the data with getline. So let's do that just to be thorough with how we can handle data in the input buffer, and then we'll move on to the other cases in just a little while. All right, so one thing I want to do as I proceed through these cases is I want to erase the ones that I've already done, because I don't want to have to type in this information over and over again. So I'm just going to take away case number 1 by just highlighting it, and I'll hit the delete key. And then we only have to work on case 2. We don't need to worry about re-entering all the data for case 1. Let's take the system pause and let's move it down here. And let's do a little cleanup with removing some white space up there. Case number 2. Okay, read all the data at once with getline. Okay, simple to do. We do getline. The input is cin, and I'm going to use in data as the string variable to collect all the data. Okay, so if you look back up at the top, you'll see there's a string type called in data. So this reads in an entire line. Remember, it reads in everything that you type, all the way up to and including that enter, the code that comes in when you hit the enter key, the \n. So we'll just read it all in, and then we'll print it all out. Let's do cout. Okay, double quote, you entered, and then a space, and then we'll just output in data with an end line afterwards. And that's all we need for this case. So it's, like I said, it's a trivial case. Let's compile the program and run it. So the program's running. I'm going to just highlight and copy that information, and I'll paste it in. And then I will hit enter, so it flows into the input buffer. Getline reads it out. So now that empties the input buffer, and we do print back to the screen what we read in with getline. So you can see that getline read everything all the way up to the \n. So when you use getline, then you can empty out the input buffer completely. So that's one way to do that. All right. Well, that was a trivial example. So let's just stop with case number 2. And since the video is starting to grow in size and time, I think that I'm going to stop the video at this point, and we'll continue with the other cases in a separate video. So I will stop at this point.